Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Alex.
Hello, hello.
And we have a very special guest with us today, Mr. Shon Hopwood, a professor of law at Georgetown University. Shon, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
This is one of those things where we like to sit down with a guest. You're here, you're in Omaha visiting for the holidays, and we kind of wanted to, pick your brain. If people don't know who you are, besides being a law professor, I think your claim to fame, if I'm correct, is you have a history of being a bank robber, which not many people can say.
Well, most people would say that might be a more honorable profession than being a lawyer. But that's the joke anyway.
Yeah.
Usually when I introduce myself, and I give this introduction, whether I'm at a church, a Rotary Club, Chamber of Commerce, a law school, I've given this intro to the President of the United States, to members of Congress. What I usually say is, my name is Shon Hopwood. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal. And I lead with that to just remind people that, redemption and grace is possible. And even when we do really awful things, really horrific things, people have the capacity to turn it around with some grace. And so that's usually why I lead with that intro, is to remind people that, those that commit crimes don't have to be a criminal for the rest of their life. And most crime, in fact, people tend to age out of it. You don't see a lot of 50 and 60-year-old men robbing banks. It's a young man's game with most crime. And so, that's just a way I try to remind people of grace and redemption.
That's good.
That is good. I have a quick random question. As a professor of law, I have one of I don't know if you'd call it like a Christian celebrity crush or of sorts, with another guy that's a law guy on the other coast, Bob Goff. Do you know Bob?
I don't.
You don't know Bob? Have you ever read any of his stuff?
I've not.
Bob Goff, Love Does. Okay, so maybe I'll send you a book in the mail.
Oh, yeah. No,
he's at
I would
Pepperdine.
love to.
Yeah, he's at Pepperdine, a law professor out there. But
that's one of my. I gave a talk at Pepperdine Law School once, and there is no more beautiful campus on the planet than that one.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's all green and overlooks the Pacific Ocean. I don't know how the students get any work done there.
Yeah. Well, one day, hope maybe when I meet Bob, we'll introduce you to him, and we can all have a great talk on this podcast. So, Bob, if you're listening, we'd love to have you on the podcast. But Eric's got some other random questions for you.
We always have 3 questions for our guests that we want to get answered. And so you don't know what these questions are, but here they come. First question is, have you ever had a nickname? And if so, what was it, or is it?
I don't think I've ever had a nickname.
No.
I've had people call me lots of names, most of which would not be repeatable here on the podcast, particularly, names that I was called while in serving 10 years in federal prison.
Yes.
But they're not the kind of names that I could share with your listeners.
Okay. Well, we'll take that.
We'll let them use their imaginations. All right. Number 2, if you had a warning label, what would it say?
If I had a warning.
Warning, Shon Hopwood.
Warning, Shon Hopwood does not believe in long punishments for anything, but may be okay with sentencing people to a long period of time when they drive in the left-hand lane and don't let cars pass them.
Okay,
that's good.
I was wondering where you're going with that for a second. That's good.
I'd like to work in that if we could spitball a law here, something to do with blinkers as well.
Yes, blinkers would help. Blinkers are optional in Washington, D.C.
Really?
Yes, very much so.
I think everyone thinks they're optional.
Yeah, I know. That's the problem.
People always run out of blinker fluid.
Yeah, it's low. I feel like it should be like the most punishable crime. Just let people know. Anyways, sorry. Number 3. This one's easy, I'm sure. What's the last book that you read?
Oh, the last book. A book by a law professor named James Foreman, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And I cannot think of the name of it right now, but it tells a story about how crime went way up in Washington, D.C. in the 80s and 90s, and how the black community responded to that, and how they wanted punitive punishments that ultimately led to mass incarceration and ultimately did not fix the problems. And it's just a book that reminds me that, people didn't set out to make the United States the world's largest incarcerator to just do it.
Yeah.
They had good motives. They just didn't realize all of the collateral consequences that would happen of doing that, and that there are other ways that we can reduce crime and keep people safe without leading the world in incarceration. I like to say, you can't say you're the land of liberty on one hand and know on the other that the United States incarcerates people at a greater rate than almost any other country on the planet. Those two things seem fundamentally inconsistent to me.
Yeah, and that's a book I'm sure most of our listeners have read as well. So I'm totally kidding. I don't know how many of our listeners are always reading law books, but that's fascinating. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about your story, and obviously we can hear that you've got a passion, I think, as somebody who's been, in federal prison and has a redemption story and all of that kind of stuff for mass incarceration, and you got a passion around that. And so we'd love to land the plane a little bit later talking about that. But we'd like to continue getting to know you a little bit, kind of getting to know your story, what led to all of your passion behind this, and maybe the young man's game that you got into that maybe got you busted in the first place, which was robbing banks, right?
Yeah.
How did that start? What were you just like in a class one day, or like just bored, or like how does one begin to think? Were you in debt? I guess what led up to you starting to rob banks?
A lot of different things, but I'd tell you the primary one was I had no purpose in life, and I was young and reckless and immature, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, come down to the bar and I want to talk." And this was the bar in David City, Nebraska, the sprawling metropolis of 2,500 people about an hour straight west of here. And we were sitting there having a beer, and he said, "Hey, what do you think about robbing a bank?" And, there should have been lots of answers to that question. If that's the question you get asked in class, there are all sorts of easy answers to that question, none of which include, yes, this sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
I don't think we really thought we were going to do it that day when we talked about it. But yeah, I was having money issues. I was in depression. After we started robbing the banks, there was alcohol and drug use involved. And I just did not consider the consequences of any actions on myself. So it was pretty easy to just not think about the consequences of my actions on anyone else.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things. I think most people just have kind of, if nothing else, a morbid curiosity, I think. And that's kind of like, well, what is that like? Like, I couldn't, but it is just kind of a normal conversation that leads to some of this stuff, right? It's not just like you were just chosen, you were some sort of gift. You were a gifted bank robber or anything like that. It was just
I was a bad bank robber.
Well, yeah, because you got caught, right? So what you said that there weren't any, you didn't feel like you knew the risk you were taking, and is that something that, until you got caught, that's probably part of the reason you kept going, because you just felt like maybe you were untouchable, or just didn't care?
It was more that once we started getting easy money without earning it, it got really easy to spend it. And the more we did this, the more I went into depression, because, I knew what we were doing was wrong, and it kept me up at night. And so I used alcohol and drugs to forget about it. And all of this is not surprising now as a scholar who studies the system, who I read social science that says young men's brains mature slower than women's do. Young men 18 to 25 are the primary causers of crime in this country. Young men struggle with impulse control, making decisions about long-term goals and long-term rewards. Instead, we want instant gratification.
Yeah.
And you think about all of these things that young men have, and it's no surprise that nobody's thinking about the consequence. That's why I tell lawmakers all the time, you set these long punishments thinking that if you give one person a 20-year sentence, it's going to deter all these other young men. But that assumes that young men act rationally.
Yeah.
And young men don't act rationally, and they don't think about the consequences. I think maybe a best case scenario about whether they're going to get caught or not, not the sentence that's going to happen once they get prosecuted and charged and plead guilty or convicted in court. And so much of our criminal justice system is based on myths about how human beings behave. And it's one of the reasons why I don't always think that long punishments serve us well when we're not going to deter anybody else. Do any of you know how many thousands of criminal statutes there are that carry criminal penalties or any of the punishments for any of those? I ask this to roomfuls of lawyers all the time.
Yeah.
No one can ever answer it. So when I hear members of Congress say, well, I'm passing this mandatory minimum so that people that are out about ready to commit crimes will know what's going to happen. And I'm like, no one's reading
Are you
this
sending
stuff.
a text message out to everybody?
Are you sending a text message to every 18 to
Yeah.
25-year-old? Because even doing that, I'm not certain you would get a whole lot of benefit from it. But it doesn't match up with how human beings behave, particularly
Right.
young men.
Yeah. So obviously, you knew it was wrong, like you said, that robbing banks is wrong, but you had no clue. Like, you weren't thinking, man, if we do get caught, this is automatically going to get us here and then here, and then we got to get this lawyer, and then here's the long game thing. You're like, okay, it's wrong. The risk is worth it.
Yep.
I might get busted, but I'm going to have a lot of fun doing it. Like, no one's thinking about that.
Nearly almost 11 years I served in federal prison. And all of that time, not one person in prison did I meet who knew how much time they were facing. It's one of the reasons why, again, I just don't think if the goal of long punishments to deter others from committing crimes, I don't think we get much in the way of that benefit.
Yeah.
Particularly for young men who aren't responding rationally to anything on the outside world anyway.
Wow. So you're in prison. You got caught on, what was it, the fifth robbery?
Yes.
And ended up punished, sent to prison. What was life like? Like, what made you start to make, I guess, decisions to get you to where you are today? Like, was it?
Well, so this is one thing people, I think, misunderstand. When a child gets caught doing something wrong, sometimes they just come clean and they're like, I did it, I'm sorry. And then sometimes people just get defensive.
Yeah.
And sometimes people get caught, particularly young men, and getting caught and sentenced doesn't all of a sudden flip a switch and they realize, oh, I need to figure out what I got to do to make sure this never happens again. That was certainly not the case for me. The first couple years in prison, what I could tell you is that I didn't like it.
Yeah.
There was nothing about federal prison that was good. And I was still that immature, young, reckless man the first couple years in prison. And it wasn't until, I somehow get this job in the prison law library where, I knew nothing about the law, could not have named it right in the Bill of Rights to you. The reason I took the job in the prison law library was it was an easier job than washing tables in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And, when I first got in there, I wanted nothing to do with the law. But then the Supreme Court decided a case that I, along with everyone else, hoped would apply to our sentence, and that, I would get a sentence reduction. And you would be amazed at what the motivation to get out of prison early can lead to.
Yeah.
And for me, it led to, starting this journey of studying law and trying to solve these legal puzzles and then writing out the solution in the form of a brief and helping other people in prison.
Wow. So what was your education before going to prison? Like high school diploma? Did you go to any college? Well,
I had a high school education,
Okay.
David City Public High School.
all right.
And then got a basketball scholarship to Midland Lutheran College in Fremont. But there was a problem. You can really only do 2 out of the 3 things in school. Go to basketball practice, go to class, and party. And I like to go to basketball practice and party, and the class not so much.
Yeah.
And so about 2 or 3 weeks in the second semester, I was kicked out of school. And so I didn't have a whole lot of formal education when I started
Gotcha.
doing the law. Not only did I have to learn the law, but I had to learn how to write.
Which, quick question about writing, and this is very serious. I've seen it on social media. How many spaces go after a period?
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble. The lawyers debate this. They have a hashtag. So I'm an appellate lawyer. I mostly do appeals.
Okay.
Which means I have a 15-minute oral argument, but outside of that, everything I do is written.
Yeah.
Written advocacy. And there is a hashtag appellate Twitter that is very popular on Twitter, and they literally debate this like, only legal nerds can.
Yeah.
Every other week. I grew up on a typewriter and was taught the 2 spaces.
Okay.
But I use a lot of justified text.
Okay.
And so I have moved into the 21st century, and I put 1 space after the period.
I think you just solved the problem. I think it's done. No more debate.
Thank you. There's there's debate among our church staff about this.
It's people are very passionate over the spaces.
I'm on team 1 space as well.
So that's the way to go. We've settled it. So do you think in some ways going through all of this, in some sort of cosmic way, like this, I feel like a lot of times we've talked about people trying to find their purpose in life, and it's like, you couldn't have written this story for yourself, but in so many ways looking back, it's like there's no way you would be nearly as passionate about this if you hadn't taken the path that you had taken.
I would have never figured out that 1, I enjoyed the law, and 2, that I had an aptitude for. If you put algebra before me, I'm lost. But law, for some reason, always just intuitively got.
Yeah.
I would have never known this had I not gone to prison. And it certainly didn't feel like God had me on a purpose while I was going through all of this.
Right.
It did not feel that way at all.
No.
But looking back, where I had all this time to study the law, where I got to help people and use my skills that I was acquiring to help other people with their cases. I got to work with some phenomenal lawyers from federal prison. And then launches me into a career of, going to law school and clerking for a federal judge, and now a law professor at a law school that, is so prestigious. I couldn't get into it when I applied there. It just feels like everything was set up for me to be on this path. But, when you're in the midst of struggle and turmoil and you're at the bottom, none of that feels inevitable.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're at Georgetown, and that's one of going from bank robber to professor, not a career path most people see themselves on. I
tell my students, do as I say, not as I do.
Right. And so I guess tell us more about, what's your day-to-day life like right now? Like what are you doing? Besides obviously teaching, like what is like kind of what drives you on a day-to-day basis?
I essentially have 3 full-time jobs. Mm-hmm. So I'm a tenure track law professor, which means I have all of the things that most law professors have. I teach classes, I have students, I mentor students. I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to get to know my students and preparing for class. And then, another part of my job is criminal justice reform. So I have worked with members of Congress, with a nonprofit called Families Against Mandatory Minimums, of which I'm on the board. I worked with the White House on criminal justice reform. I'm doing some work down in Florida on that. And then the other third of my life is I still litigate cases. So when I see that there's a legal issue that will impact not only that person whose case the issue arises in, but issues that if I can get a court to rule in that person's favor, it will impact thousands of other people. I still litigate cases. And so I'll just give you an indication of how this works out. Next week's going to be fun for me. I teach 2 classes on Monday and have office hours with students all day in between. We're getting towards the end of the semester. I always say the end of the semester, I become a very popular professor, not because I've gotten any better, but because everybody's worried about the exams. So all of a sudden they come to office hours. Then Tuesday, I take a train up to New York, and I have a big speaking event up there on criminal justice reform. And then a guy that is helping fund a particular case got me a private jet to fly me from New York to Tallahassee, Florida, late Tuesday night. And Wednesday morning in Tallahassee, I will be arguing a person's case for clemency before the governor of Florida, the attorney general of Florida, the ag secretary, and the CFO of Florida. And then I will fly home Wednesday night.
So do you have where's family time in this? Is there family time or sleep?
There is. Well, I'm very, very fortunate that I have an amazing wife who is very supportive of my efforts, and herself, she just finished law school last December. Wow. Got her law license this summer, and we just filed our first brief together a few weeks ago. But I could not do all of this stuff without her. I'm pretty good about compartmentalizing and making sure, especially the weekends, are about my wife and kids and family. But we're busy, and it's a juggling act all the time. So we somehow seem to make it work.
That's awesome. I wonder too, like, this is more maybe a personal question for me. I think in the past years you've seen a growing popularity of things like the Serial podcast and things like that, where kind of everybody's trying to be a gumshoe detective, and I think also it's bringing to the surface the problems with our criminal justice system. I think recently I saw a headline that the Adnan Syed case, the Supreme Court wasn't going to look at it; they were going to pass over it again. Do you think stuff like that is helping the cause, or is it hurting the cause? Is it a little of both?
No, I think it's all helping. I mean, we've had more media talking about the problems with the American criminal justice system and the fact that we lock up way too many people. That has all been a huge help, and I think that's the reason we're finally starting to see criminal justice reform. And, some reformers, I think, get a little upset when celebrities get on board and get the credit. I love it because,
So you're pro Kim Kardashian.
I am very pro Kim Kardashian. Met her at the White House, and, she's not doing this to make money. She has enough money. And she's in it for the right reasons. And, why wouldn't we want her? She has more Twitter followers than multiple countries combined.
Right.
The fact that she's talking about these things, and, her husband Kanye is doing a concert in a Texas prison. This is waking Americans up to, some of the huge problems with the justice system. And it has become a huge problem. 113 million Americans, which is a huge number, have someone in their close to immediate family who's been to jail or prison within their lifetime. And that's staggering to me.
And yet, I think what's even almost more scary is that there's people who haven't had that touch them, who just think that it's not a problem, who think that this is just bad people go to jail and that's the end of the story.
I get that.
And I think that's one thing that I think stuff like this is so good for people to hear, that if they're living in this kind of a very safe place where they don't realize how people are being wrongly persecuted or incarcerated for these lengths of time, that it just isn't fair.
So no one in my family had ever been to jail, let alone prison, when I got arrested and charged and convicted and sentenced. And I, along with most of my family, thought what a lot of Americans do, which is, well, prison's where the evil people go.
Right.
It's where the worst of the worst goes. And then I went to prison, and what I saw was not evil people or the worst of the worst. It was just people that, for whatever reason, made really poor decisions. But most of them, I'm not saying all, there were certainly some that are dangerous and probably always will be dangerous, but it was a small segment of the people I saw. Most of them have the power to turn it around. They just needed some help. And that was certainly the case for me. And I tell you, every week I get emails. Every week, probably 20 emails that are some mom is emailing me saying, I never knew how bad the system was until my son or daughter gets caught and arrested and sentenced. And I realize how unjust and how cruel the system is. And it makes me furious.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out how to make people furious about the system before their sons or daughters or nieces or nephews are locked up. And that's the case for a lot of people. You know, the reason I got started working with the White House on the First Step Act was Jared Kushner called me, and I had a meeting with him, and he's like most Americans. He said, you know, these are his words, not mine. Shon, I'm a rich Jew from New York. I know nothing about going to prison. Right up to the point where, 10 years ago, his dad went to federal prison for 18 months. And once you're impacted, it wakes you up to the problems. And that's why he was so passionate about pushing criminal justice reform at the White House.
Yeah, and I think one thing, like with the media and social media and like people like Kim Kardashian, Kanye doing things in prison is, I think there's a word called ignorance that a lot of times we think is like the worst thing ever. Like if we say we're ignorant about something, that means like we're stupid, we're dumb, all those. To be ignorant is like, please do not associate that with me. But that's just a reality about all of us in our lives is we're just faultlessly ignorant. There's just things that we don't have experiences with that until we have a brush with that or know somebody with that, we're just not going to have an empathy. We're going to be ignorant to it. And that's not a bad thing to call ourselves like, I've never been to prison, I've never been in jail. I've got friends and family members.
There's always time for you, Alex.
Yeah, there is time. And, yeah, so there's a lot of things in our lives that passion, I think a lot of times is bred out of experiencing something and building empathy for someone, and then also just saying, hey, I'm ignorant about something, and that's okay to say I'm ignorant, but I want to learn more. And so I think what social media, what these celebrities are doing is helping break us of our faultless ignorance. It's no one's fault that you're ignorant, but we are, and we have to wake up to that. And so I think that's a good thing. There.
Maybe you could help us with our ignorance a little bit. Tell us some ways. I'm sure just the average Joe right now sitting, on his couch watching TV with, his Alexa listening to him. What's something that he's doing in his house that he doesn't even realize is illegal right now? Like, what's something that
this is something I talk about a lot, which is over-criminalization. At some point, our state legislatures and the U.S. Congress thought that every problem can be fixed if we just make it illegal and attach a long sentence to it. Mm-hmm. It used to be the case that we had a couple hundred federal crimes. We now have over 5,000. Nobody knows, not even the Department of Justice knows how many laws there are federally that carry criminal penalties. And then every state has several thousand. I say it all the time, and it's not being glib. Most of America has broken federal law at some point in their life and have no idea.
Yeah.
I'll give you just one statute that doesn't get enforced a lot, but that certainly, since Nebraska is a state of gun owners, should worry people, which is there's a statute that says anyone who has used or abused a drug on the controlled substance list and then possessed a firearm is no different than I would be as a felon possessing a firearm. It exposes you up to 10 years in federal prison. So anyone that's smoked a joint at some point in their life and then possessed a firearm is guilty of this. Now, President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama all admitted to using cocaine and marijuana at some point in their life, and there's pictures of all three of them holding guns on the internet. So you could say the last three presidents of the United States committed federal felonies. Particularly now with the whole West Coast has in Colorado legalized marijuana recreationally. Yeah. You can imagine there are millions of people. Whatever you do over the holidays, do not draw a picture of Smokey the Bear, because if you misappropriate the Smokey the Bear insignia, you are exposing yourself up to 6 months in jail.
Wow.
If you sell something on eBay or Craigslist, maybe you sell a car and there's something wrong with the exhaust, but you don't mention that in the ad, you probably just committed wire fraud. I mean, there's so many crimes that there's a Twitter handle called Crime a Day that has a new federal crime every day. And in 2008, he said, I have posted a new crime every day for the last 365 days. And at this rate, it will only take me 80 more years to cover all the rest.
Holy cow.
So, you know, I mean, we tend to think that that's the solution. I'll give you one example. You know, we have an issue with teens sexting. But does anybody think the solution, as some states have done, is to criminalize that and make a 16-year-old a sex offender for life and a felon because they sent a picture of themselves naked to somebody else?
Yeah.
Why is that the solution to that problem? It should not be.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of ways that we can fix those problems, but just making something illegal and punishing people for it doesn't work.
Yeah. And it's not, no one's saying that's not wrong, but it's like we have to think about in our world, like we all know that's wrong, but how do we actually punish? How is there redemption? How do we not just criminalize this person for the rest of their life because they literally can't fully think logically because their brain isn't processing
They don't think
firing.
about the consequences.
Yeah, it's impossible.
The last thing on earth you would want to do to a 16-year-old is give them a felony conviction when there are... Well, there's a misconception that once you've served the time and served your punishment for your crime that you get out and you get the second chance, but that's not true.
Yeah.
There are over 300,000 collateral consequences of felony conviction. You can be legally discriminated against in housing, employment, public benefits. Some states you lose your voting rights forever. And it just impacts your life in all sorts of ways, great and small, for the rest of your life. Particularly in the Google age. You know, 20 years ago, someone gets out of prison, unless they share that with someone, probably no one knows, especially if they move to a new community.
Yeah.
But I have had many, many experiences over the years where people have Googled my name and I didn't know about it. Particularly, you know, I always worry when we've got parents of who have children that are at the same school as my kid's school who say, hey, let's have a play date. We'll send our kids over to your house. And I worry about do I need to tell them? And ultimately I always do, because I don't want some parent sending their kid over to my house and then finding out later, oh my gosh, I just sent my kid over to the bank robber's house. Now you would think they would be okay with it. You know, I've been in the White House 15 times in the last 2 years. If the Secret Service is okay letting me in there, you would think that. But those are the small things that will impact someone's life forever.
And not just your life at that point. It could impact your kids' lives. They did nothing to deserve that.
It has impacted my kids and my wife. And so, you know, if we think sexting is an issue, the solution is not to turn a 16-year-old into a felon for life.
Right.
That's not going to fix the problem. It's not going to stop other kids from doing that. And really, all it's going to do is make the problem worse. But for some reason, we've for a while, we just came to the conclusion that every social ill needs to be fixed with criminal law and crime and punishment. And it's no wonder then that, you know, our prisons now hold 2.2 million people, which is, again, an astonishing. It would be like taking razor wire and fence and going around Houston. That many people. And I just don't think that here's what I like to say. If that system was actually preventing crime and keeping us safer, I'd still be screaming it's unjust. But everything I see as a legal scholar tells me that's not actually fixing things. In some way, it's making things worse. Because the great irony of the American criminal justice system is sometimes the longer someone spends in corrections, the least likely they are to be corrected and come out and live a law-abiding, successful life. And most people are coming out. 650,000 a year coming out of American prisons back into our communities to be our neighbors.
Wow.
And the system is almost, it feels like it's almost set up for them to fail anyways. They can't, even once they get out, between their parole, the fees that they have to pay, they're trying to get a job and no one wants to hire them, and then they're on the hook for all these other types of costs that come along with it. And is that all part of this system that you're fighting, you're kind of railing against, right?
So we have a huge recidivism rate, which is the rate at which people who come out of prison end up going back. And I would tell you that most of it is not, I did not see a lot of people in prison who said, you know what? I can't wait to get out and go commit the next robbery or go sell the next kilo of cocaine. Most people are not saying, most people are want nothing to do with that and want to do the right thing. But if you get out and you can't find a job and you can't find a place to live, and it's a choice between homelessness and crime, well, you know what? If all of us were put to that choice, most people would choose the rational choice, which is crime. Because no one chooses to be homeless.
Yeah.
It's why we have to have interventions to make sure that people don't get to that choice. And if we gave just a little bit of help, you know, I often tell people we all change from like 20 to 40. Mm-hmm. None of us are the same people we were when we were in our 20s. Thank God. And if we know that, why do we think people in prison can't change? And if the answer is, well, because of the environment they're in, well, then maybe that says something about that environment and not necessarily about them as individuals.
Yeah.
That's good. So I want to know a little bit about like your spiritual life and like how faith has impacted this. Were you raised like as a Christian? Did some light did God come and write with his finger when you were in prison on a jail cell? Like how did that happen? And how does like your discipleship, you know, and your passion for justice and all of those things, but also dealing with a Christian faith and worldview, how does discipleship look in that and helping grow and say, hey, no, this is wrong, and here's steps to continue to take in life to fix things and not just have behavior modification, but like giving those things to Christ. So what's your discipleship look like? How did you become serious about this in your life?
Well, this is the part that's going to scare everyone that's listening that goes to your church and has children.
Okay.
I grew up in a solid Christian home in high school. Went to church, went to Bible study, you know, did all the things that most churchgoers do, and yet still robbed the banks. That's the part that always scares people when I go to churches and talk about this. You know, I always knew who God was, but in high school was just not trying to hear it. Was very rebellious, and the more my parents tried to push it, the further away from God I got. And you know, when I go to prison, I think most people think that I just, you know, had an epiphany there and all of a sudden decided, and it wasn't that way. It was years and years of what felt like God pushing me in certain directions and what felt like, you know, just receiving a whole lot of grace when I didn't deserve it. I mean, people tend to look at my story as a pick yourself up by the bootstrap story. That's not it at all. My story is I could have been the hardest working, smartest lawyer on the planet, neither of which is true. And that would not have mattered for my success. My success is because people gave me grace and went out of their way to do it when there wasn't much in it for them. And so, you know, by the time I'm coming out of prison, I just kind of realized, like, I need to get God back in my life. Obviously, when I was doing things myself, it didn't lead to the best of decisions and the best of outcomes. And, you know, I just started to see patterns. Well, just to give you one example. So, you know, I start writing these briefs for other prisoners, and one of the things that happen is I get 2 cases granted by the Supreme Court of the United States. That doesn't happen for lawyers. And the chance of that happening for indigent federal prisoners filing briefs on their own without a lawyer is about 1% of 1%. So I would love to sit there and look at that like, oh, I'm just really that good that I convinced the Supreme Court. But I know that's not true. And, you know, so much of my life has been random circumstances where people helped me. And after a while, when you get older, you start to look at those things and think, well, maybe they're not so random. Maybe it wasn't I just was lucky time and time again, that there was something behind it. And when I got out, you know, I wanted to reinvigorate a relationship with God and did it through Christ Community Church. This was the first church that I went to when I got out of prison. It was the first church that my wife and I, who was not initially my wife at the time, it's the first church we ever went to together. And we started that journey here. And, you know, the story of grace, no group of people should be more in favor of criminal justice reform than the church. If you believe in the gospel of grace, you have to believe that that plays out for people that have broken the law. No one should be judged by their worst day. If we all were, you know, I've had some funny stories over the years where federal judges, prosecutors, FBI agents, I always know when it's coming because they'll, hey, Shon, if I got caught for some of the things I did in my 20s, I didn't rob any banks, but if I got caught for some of the things I did in my early 20s, I would not be in this job today. And I feel like Americans and Christians forget that. And the grace aspect is really what motivates me. I was given grace, and I feel like if we had some more grace in the criminal justice system, there'd be a lot more second chances and redemption, and I would not be this anomaly story. Mm-hmm. We would have thousands of these stories.
Yeah, I will. After we're off air, I'll whisper the same thing into your ear. You know that.
Don't want to admit it here now.
I don't want to admit it.
If you have some crimes that we could get on record.
Without grace and without, man, I wouldn't be in this job either without grace and people caring for me and loving me. And thank God Snapchat and things like that weren't there to incriminate me for all the just stupid things. Not just like blatantly hurting or painful, but just stupid things that could have gotten me busted. So.
I feel bad for kids nowadays because they share too much information.
Yeah.
And, some of them ends up in criminal charges because of things they post on Facebook. And it's a scary age because, the consequences get so severe the older you become. And, some kids, if I had Instagram or Twitter or things like that when I was in high school, oh my gosh, it would not have been good.
Not at all. So...
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you've been to the White House a lot lately. So you shook the president's hand. How was that? Was it clammy, warm? Was it?
Yeah, the president, I think, gets a kick out of me.
Yeah.
Because of my story, and he's always very welcoming to me. And
that's awesome.
I am very bipartisan in that, when I became an advocate for criminal justice reform, I'm registered as an independent. I do not care about Republican and Democrat. And, I may be in the president's office one day and the next day, meeting with Dick Durbin from Illinois, who's a very liberal Democrat. And those sorts of politics don't really matter to me. But I was encouraged to see, the president come out in favor of criminal justice reform, and I was fortunate that the day the First Step Act was passed, which was December 21st of last year, I got to be in the Oval Office and watch as the president signed the bill. And that was quite the day because, while I would say the First Step Act's very modest reform on the one hand, on the other, it's the best reform bill to come out of Congress in my 44 years of life.
Wow.
And so I'm very thankful that the president, very thankful that the Secret Service lets me in the door every time.
Yeah.
I'm always just waiting for them to say, wait a second, we just figured out who you are. And I'm just thankful that, like members of Congress and the president really want to fix this. And we're finally starting to see an end of the tough on crime era and a start on the let's be smart on crime era.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
So average Jane and average Joe listening to this that have never been to prison, never going to go to prison, what are just some takeaways, that we can take to become more woke, more alive, more engaged in what criminal justice reform looks like? How can we play a role in that? Not even just politically, but like how do we just as people in the middle of Nebraska play a role in some of these things that you're passionate about?
Yeah, well, I'd say the first thing is we don't need to lock up 2.2 million people to keep us safe. No other country on the planet does this but us. You look at our crime rates and Canada's crime rates, they've gone up and down almost in unison for the last 30 years, but they lock up a fraction of the people that we do. And so, I don't think using incarceration as a first resort as much as we do now is wise policy. It also turns out that, when we sentence someone, we think we're just punishing them. But rarely is that the case. A lot of the men I served time with had wives and kids. And when they go away, sometimes, those families really struggle and they're punished too. We know that children who have an incarcerated parent, much higher risk of behavioral problems, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, suicide, and even a much higher risk of them going to prison themselves. And so we tend to get mad at someone and want to punish them, but there are all of these other social costs that are involved with sending someone to prison that I don't think we think about a lot of the times. And everyone should care because, again, 95% of the people that we send to prison are coming home one day. And if we send them to prison and we make them much more violent, much more antisocial, we take away their ability to have social interactions with people in a healthy way. They have no job skills by the time they come out. That's not a very good recipe for success. And, this plays out in all sorts of ways. So when you have conflict in a prison, there's no such thing as de-escalation. Someone gets up and yells in your face, you yell louder. If somebody punches you, you punch harder. Now, imagine, I had done 11 years in that environment, and then I get out and get married right away. Imagine how the arguments go in my house for about the first 2 years. My poor wife, I didn't know any other way other than escalate any sort of conflict. Turns out that does not work very well in a marriage.
Not a great marriage plan.
It's not a great marriage plan, but it's just not a good plan for anyone coming out of the prison system. And so, I want to see stuff that's based on people being held accountable, but more of a focus on how do people that commit crimes, how can they fix the harm that they caused? I'm always just amazed at the criminal justice system. There's no process by which the defendant has to sit and think, what is it that led me to having to stand before this judge and get sentenced today? What do I need to do today and tomorrow to fix the harm of the crime I caused? And what do I need to do today and tomorrow to make sure that this never happens again? There's no part of the system that's really thinking about those issues. And I don't think, most victims of crime feel like they're represented well in the system either. Sending someone to prison for 10 years is not going to, bring back the money that was stolen from them. It's not going to fix the harm if they were a victim of violent crime. And so, a more restorative justice, grace, mercy, rehabilitation model to me makes a whole lot more sense. And other countries do this, and they've had a lot of success. And we just have to get out of this mindset that everything that goes wrong, we need to turn into a crime, and we need to send people to prison for as long as we do.
Alex, you have some questions?
That's a whole lot in one.
No,
yes,
that's good. Just a couple
questions
random
from
questions
social media
as we land. That a couple people asked if I can get into my phone and remember my password. One of them is, I think you've answered a couple. So how did you even get a job out of prison as a lawyer? Like how does that happen?
Well, I didn't get a job out of prison as a lawyer.
Okay, so you didn't just...
So I was released to the halfway house in Council Bluffs in the fall of 2008.
Okay.
Remember what the economy was like then?
Not great.
Yeah, it was hard for anyone to find work, let alone the 5-time bank robber. I was rejected for lots of jobs. My first job was telemarketing in Council Bluffs. I had to... I had been in prison for 11 years. Again, social skills kind of deteriorate. They put me on a telephone and made me call people in Oregon around dinner time for a political campaign. And, people would get on the phone and be very angry and yell and scream and cuss. And so my response was to yell and scream and cuss back. And that job lasted one day. And then my second job was washing cars at a car dealership in Council Bluffs. But again, this was October, and I washed cars outside, and I realized this job's not going to last much longer, like a month tops.
Yeah.
And then I was lucky to get an interview with the job at Cockle Legal Briefs, which is a little family-owned business downtown Omaha that helps lawyers all over the country file briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's crazy that it's located in downtown Omaha. It's crazy that I stumbled across it, but that, the Cockles gave me my first big break, and that they gave me a job. And that job led a reporter from the New York Times to find out about my story and write an article, and that led to going to law school at the University of Washington School of Law. after I graduated, you have to show that you have the character and fitness necessary to practice law. And let's just say I had like a 6.5 hour hearing. That was, not a whole lot of fun when people trot out all of the worst things you've ever done in life, and you're judged all over again, even though, it had been almost 20 years since I had committed the crime by that point. But, they gave me a law license, and now I have a license in both Washington State and the District of Columbia, and I'm admitted in federal courts kind of all over the country. And I get to work on, just some really amazing cases for people that, of course, did wrong, but again, have the capacity to change. And, well, I won't get into a story, but maybe we can talk about one of my more famous clients, Matthew Charles.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you his story real quick. I can do it in like 2 minutes.
You've teased it now. People will want to know.
Unless it's in your book.
It's not in the book.
Okay.
Because it's really recent. So Matthew committed a lot of really ugly crimes in his 20s. And when he's 28, he gets caught selling crack. And a federal judge looks at him and says, I need to lock you up. You're a danger to society. I'm going to give you a 35-year sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. But what he couldn't see is that Matthew would go to prison, find Jesus. Matthew does 21 straight years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons without one incident report. I'm often held up as the model of rehabilitation. I had 2 incident reports in 10 years, and that's only because I got caught twice. Matthew does 21 years with a sterling prison record. He then files a motion, and a judge lets him out. He goes back to Nashville. He makes community in his church there. He gets a girlfriend, gets a job, place to live. He volunteers every Saturday morning at a soup kitchen for the homeless called The Little Pantry That Could. He's out for 2 years, does everything right, and the Department of Justice had appealed his release and won, and a judge had to bring him back into court with 40 members of his church there and resentence him to 9 more years in federal prison. That's when I started representing him to try and get him clemency from the president. And after the First Step Act was passed, he was the first person released under the First Step Act.
Wow.
And he gets out, and I've got Lester Holt's NBC Nightly News crew there filming him coming out of the jail. 2 weeks later, he is in the U.S. Congress as a guest of the president at the State of the Union. And now he does work with churches and criminal justice reform organizations all over the country, and he's just the most humble man I've ever met, and just an amazing guy. And again, just this example of grace and redemption that played out to the point where he's serving 9 more years in federal prison, and 2 weeks later he's at the White House and then the guest of the president.
Wow. That's a
those are really
story.
cool stories that I get to be a part of cases like that. We actually had Matthew over to our house. We watch a lot of Matthew's TV clips. My daughter thinks Matthew is like as famous as Kim Kardashian. So she was like, how do I talk to Matthew? He's so famous.
That's funny.
That's a really powerful story. And I think I don't think we could end the podcast any better than on that note.
That's good. You do have a book, though, right?
Let's
I do.
plug away.
It's called Lawman, Memoir of a Jailhouse Lawyer, and it kind of tells the whole story. And just tells, when you read the book, the one thing you'll come away with is, Shon did not do all of this on his own. There is no possible way that he was just so good that all of these things happen. And
Cool.
And it's the truth. It's a story at its core of grace and second chances and redemption.
Awesome. Well, thanks for jumping back here to CCC. Thanks for sharing with us, and looking forward to hopefully people that are hearing this, thinking, okay, I can take a step. I can acknowledge my ignorance a little bit, and I can see that I'm so grateful as a person that's a recipient of grace that I need to be a person that actually hands that out a little bit more than I do. So
well, I tell everybody when they want to know how to get involved, go teach a class in prison. You might impact the men and women there, but it will profoundly change you. I guarantee you that.
Wow.
Cool.
And what's cool is CCC has lived this out through its ministry at the Douglas County Jail. I was here when that first happened, and have been very proud to see the church take that on.
That's cool.
That's awesome. Well, thanks, Shon. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. If you want to reach out to us, you can do that by sending us an email. That's podcast@cccomaha.org, or you can reach out to us on social media @cccomaha. Until next time, we'll see you then.